I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we talk to Colin Freeman, the Telegraph's journalist in Kyiv, and we'll hear from Iuliia Osmolovska, the woman giving negotiating advice to the Ukrainians during their peace talks with Russia.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 27, and joining our conversation today is Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's defence and security editor, Mutaz Ahmed from our comment team, and Colin Freeman, who's calling in from Kyiv. Before we get to Colin, Dom Nicholls gave us the latest updates from the last 24 hours.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. It's been a fairly static 24 hours. The latest MOD assessment was exactly that. So the Russian offensive has continued to stall, get bogged down. There have actually been a few counterattacks by Ukrainian forces, certainly to the west of Ukraine. They pushed into the town of Makariv yesterday, about 20 km to the west of Kyiv. That seems to have held. They did also take back the area around Hostomel airfield to the northwest, that airfield that Russia tried to take in an air assault on the first day, presumably as a launch point then into the capital. That faltered, that air assault, and the Hostomel airfield has been contested ever since. It was reported to be back in Ukrainian hands. It now looks like it may have been retaken by Russia. So a lot of heavy fighting into the northwest of Kyiv. And elsewhere, Mariupol is still holding out. There's been a push to the northwest, about 30 k's away from Mariupol, and also they're trying to get into the outer suburbs in the northeast of the city itself. But it doesn't look like they're able to get through to the what's left of the Ukrainian defence right in the centre of the city there. So that's basically been it from the sort of tactical movements on the ground. We still haven't seen anything more really from Russia apart from long-range shelling and continued activity, missiles and what have you from the air. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Tom. Colin, can I bring you in here? Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about where you are and what's happening in Kyiv today?
Yes, I'm one of the Telegraph's foreign correspondents. I've been here in Kyiv for about 3 weeks now, really just trying to cover the events as they unfold here on the ground. At the moment, I'm speaking from the bedroom of the Airbnb that I'm staying at in Kyiv. Won't be going very far from there today because we are under curfew, which started last night. It's a 35-hour curfew. It finishes tomorrow morning. The purpose of that, well, it depends on who you ask, but officially the purpose of these curfews is to allow the Ukrainian military to keep a close eye on the city's streets, usually to, so they say anyway, usually to keep an eye out for Russian saboteurs who might be trying to infiltrate the city. The logic being that if the streets are completely empty of people other than security forces, it is rather easier to spot Russian saboteurs coming in, whereas if the streets are full of people coming and going, then those saboteurs can clearly blend in with the wider population. There may be other military purposes to it as well in terms of making military movements more easy. I'm really not quite sure, to be honest.
And what's day-to-day life like in Kyiv? We're in the 26th, 27th day of the war now. How have things changed?
Well, it's surprising. I was just having a conversation with a colleague, actually, who's coming in possibly to replace me in about a week's time. And I think I've kind of got used to it. When I first got here, about 5 days into the invasion, I took the train in. The train still runs, remarkably, from Lviv in western Ukraine. I got here, and as you left the station area was, felt like a normal station, really. But as you drove into town, it was very clear that there was very, very few people around, and it really did feel something of a ghost town. I think there are more people on the streets now than there were in the immediate days following the start of the invasion, I would say 3 weeks ago. Having said that, it may just be also that I've got used to driving around in places where there's very, very few people. But certainly the estimates are that about maybe half of Kyiv's population has fled, which is about 3 million people or so total population. So maybe there's about 1.5 million still here, which is not insubstantial.
And what's the morale like amongst the Ukrainians you're talking to?
Well, when I speak to people, most people are all like, yep, glory be to Ukraine, we're staying here, we're in for the fight, and so on. But we always have to bear in mind in these situations that there may be a response given to foreign journalists, and then there may be a private feeling which is rather different. Some people certainly are, very buoyed with the way the war has gone so far. They feel that this has brought the country together as a nation. It's brought it's brought out the best in the country's politicians, who until now were known for infighting and corruption and other things, pretty much like politicians around the world, I suppose. So there was a sense of optimism, and that the country is doing pretty well against these Russian invaders. But occasionally you speak to people who have stayed so far. We were at a bombing, covering the scene of a bombing yesterday, where a shopping mall was hit by a missile. And I spoke to a lady there who lived in a flat nearby, which had been partly damaged by the missile. And she said, "Look, I've been here. I've stuck it out until now, but that missile was really big, and it was too close for comfort. And I think I'm going to leave Kyiv now. I just really don't like it here anymore." And I said to her, "Have you been to? Can you describe what you saw when you immediately after the bomb went off?" And she said, "No, I haven't been round the corner of my flat to actually look at the impact site. I don't want to. I'm quite stressed out enough as it is," which I think gives you a little bit of an insight into the fact that not everybody is finding this what's the word? A lot of people are finding this pretty tough going. Not everybody is out cheering on the troops and really feeling that sort of patriotic surge. I think a lot of people are just like, God, I would really like this all to be over.
You wrote a really moving account of the funeral of a Ukrainian soldier a few days ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was the atmosphere like?
Yeah, it was at the cemetery was empty. We went down there partly actually just to have a look around the cemetery, because we understood that there had been a number of new war dead that had been buried there in recent days. And as it happened, a funeral took place while we were there. It was a fairly brief affair, really. A bus turned up with a group of soldiers on board. They were actually a ceremonial guard whose duty, as I understand it at the moment, is simply to be on hand to provide a send-off for soldiers who are at the front. About half an hour later, a vehicle carrying a coffin turned up, and it was the vehicle duly drove further into the cemetery, and a priest, an Orthodox priest, then said some prayers over the coffin, and there was a ceremonial guard armed with swords and Ukrainian flags who stood to attention as the coffin was lowered into the ground. And then there was only one of the soldiers' actual comrades was with him. He had accompanied the coffin from the front line. We didn't really get any information about this soldier other than his name, and that he had been killed defending Kyiv on March the 15th, about a week ago. This one soldier who had come with him, who I wouldn't say I'm an expert in these things, but looked kind of battle worn and weary, and looked very much like a man who had places to go. He turned up for the duration of the funeral, which was about 20 minutes, and then shot off straight away. It was a business-like affair. And the only other thing that he said was that the deceased's father was currently in the city of Mariupol, which some of your listeners will be aware is the focus of the main Russian siege, this port city in the southeast, where thousands of people have been reported to have been killed and hundreds of thousands are still trapped. The dead soldier's father was in the city of Mariupol, and he did not know yet that his son had died, which is pretty sad, really. And that was about all we got. And then with that, the soldier headed off, and as we spoke, there was the sounds of shell fire somewhere quite near. We don't know where, and that kind of hastened proceedings to a close. But those funerals are taking place, I think, on a pretty regular basis at the moment. We counted, I think, probably about a dozen freshly dug graves in the cemetery, and I think there may have been more. It's a big place; it's not possible to look round it all. And also in one part of the cemetery, there was a large number of graves commemorating people who have died in the campaign in eastern Ukraine since 2014, when Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea and also the pro-separatist republics set up there. So that, there has been a war going on here for the best part of 8 years already, and it's claimed a number of lives.
Mutaz or Dom, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, just a quick question for Colin. When you tell people you work for a British newspaper or you're a British journalist, or if you ask them about sort of Britain and what Britain is doing, is there a particular sort of reaction you get from them?
Yes, generally speaking, Britons are quite popular in certainly in Kyiv at the moment. We get the occasional Boris Johnson, yes, good kind of thing, which I guess you don't get that much at home. And then we also get occasional comments from soldiers at checkpoints. We're flashing our passports, once every 10 minutes when we drive around Kyiv because of all the checkpoints. And there's the occasional sort of grunt of appreciation for the M laws. I can't remember what the acronym is, but it's the anti-tank missiles that Britain sent Ukraine about 6 or 7 weeks ago before the war started. So there's occasional nods of appreciation for those as well. One sometimes feels like one is a sort of travelling arms dealer or something. But yes, the Britain's support for Ukraine has not gone unnoticed. I think it's fair to say that, yeah, by the ordinary people, not just at the state level.
Thanks, Colin. Dom Nichols, do you want to have any thoughts on anything we've been speaking about?
Yes, thanks. Hi, Colin. Great to hear from you, and thanks for your absolutely vital work. It's essential that we all get to hear what it's like on the ground. Can I ask you a little bit about the messaging from the leadership and President Zelensky? So over here we see a lot on social media from him directly or from his team, but more broadly from the Ukrainian government, and they're absolutely smashing the information war against Russia on social media, and he doesn't seem to be. Zelensky doesn't seem as if he's hiding in his bunker. He's doing a lot of messaging and videos out and about. I'm just conscious that you're now under a curfew potentially to sort of see if there are any of these Russian saboteurs around, and we hear reports of Wagner Group looking to assassinate him and what have you. Did you get a feel that there is this kind of bunker mentality from the leadership and other people over there getting the same messages? Do they believe in their leader? Are they seeing these very positive, upbeat messages that we're seeing over here?
Yeah, to answer your second question first, Dominic, quite often when I'm out and about, I ask people, what do you think of President Zelensky? And generally speaking, people say, yeah, he's done a good job. He stepped into the role that was required of him at this time. They might have their criticisms about how he runs the government day to day, but he does seem to have that sort of Churchill factor, I suppose you could say. And part of that is because of the fact that he stayed in the country. As to his occasional appearances, that I think they certainly are effective. These occasional sort of videos that he produces of him on walkabouts around the city. I suspect they're fairly carefully planned ahead, and that he doesn't spend very much time on the ground when he's doing them, or and that he's very careful not to leave any geolocating traces, etc., because I would imagine that there is probably a missile, or quite possibly a missile with his name on it somewhere in Russia. But I think they're quite effective, though, in portraying him as a kind of guerrilla leader type, a Robin Hood against Mr. Putin, who it's very easy to like see as this kind of aging supervillain at his big long table, surrounded by his elderly acolytes. I think that is certainly the way it's played on social media. So the PR war certainly has certainly been won, I think, internationally by Mr. Zelensky. One thing, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, who many of your listeners will know was better known as a world heavyweight boxing champion until recently. He does go around quite a few of the bomb sites, but where there's been shelling here in the capital in recent days. He's makes quite regular appearances at some of them, which suggests that he's perhaps slightly less concerned about his security or whatever. So he does go around, but I dare say he's not quite as high profile a target as Mr. Zelensky is.
Just a question from me, Colin. We see a lot about how Russian dissidents would like to frame this as Putin's war, not Russia's war. What's your sense from people on the ground in Kyiv? Do they see that? Do they see Putin, as you said, as a sort of the grand supervillain, and ordinary Russians are separate from him, or not?
I think it depends on who you talk to. You do hear people saying, describing the Russians as orcs, ORCS, which some of it's become a common phrase to describe the invading Russian army. The orcs have done this, or the orcs have done that. You may be familiar with the term. It actually comes from the Tolkien novels, and it means a kind of unpleasant sort of goblin type character, and that has become a common term of abuse for the Russian army. To what extent people are sort of saying we hate all Russians as opposed to just Mr. Putin, I'm not quite clear. I think if you are living in some of these villages on the outskirts of Kiev and elsewhere where you've had bad interactions with Russian forces who've maybe come to your house and or looted your shops or shot up your village or whatever, then yes, I think it's probably like we're not keen on any Russians. Amongst those who have not experienced that directly, I think there is more just a sense that this is this is about Vladimir Putin and the people around him, as opposed to the ordinary Russian population. Lots of people here, for example, have friends and relatives living in Russia. I should also point out that just in the interests of balance, we've spoken to people who've had interactions with Russian soldiers when their villages have been invaded by them and so on, and that they do say that quite a lot of the Russian soldiers treat them in a fairly professional manner. They're courteous. They don't go around harming people just for the sake of it. So it's easy to assume that from some of the reporting, that every single Russian soldier here is looting and pillaging and shooting with impunity. You do hear other accounts though that suggest that some of them are taking a fairly professional attitude and just doing what just following orders, really. Although most people here obviously would rather they weren't following those orders.
I don't know if Mutaz or Dom, if you want to come in at this point.
If I may, please. Yeah, just one other question, Colin. We're talking about, we're looking at the negotiations today. A bit of reporting about that. President Zelensky has made some comments this morning, and I mean. So as part of this podcast that's coming out later, I interviewed Iuliia Osmolovska, who's one of the advisors to the government about the negotiations. And she was saying that essentially we're in a kind of phony war at the moment. The negotiating teams just aren't, they're not getting anywhere really, because neither side sees their advantage being furthered through the talks rather than on the battlefield. And both sides need to see that the battlefield is waning and talks will offer more before they seriously engage in negotiations. But of course, from more so the Russian side, we hear, oh yeah, talks going very well. A few days, we might have a draft agreement, and this is all seen as stalling. What's the mood amongst the people over there? Do they view these talks are actually doing anything, or do they see them as a bit of a sham at the moment? Is it just sort of a false hope that's being held out, or maybe you're not getting any visibility of them at all?
In one sense, I think people are not paying too much attention to the talks because a lot of the time they're just simply too consumed by what is going on around them. And then, as you've also said, Dom, there is a feeling that if these talks are going on, as long as the battlefield situation remains unresolved, then these are going to be kind of very much talks in the preliminary sense of the word, rather than anything that is going to yield a concrete agreement that is going to stop the fighting. We did ask some people last week about whether they felt that giving up on agreeing never to join NATO was a fair price to pay for peace with Russia, and there was mixed opinion on that. So, as some of your listeners will know already, this is something that President Zelensky has said a couple of weeks ago. He said, look, we're prepared not to join NATO. We were never going to get NATO membership anyway, so if that's what it costs for peace with Russia, then why not? Some people are sort of saying, well, yeah, that's fair enough. If Mr. Zelensky can present that as a concession to NATO, as a concession to Mr. Putin, agreeing not to join NATO, i.e. agreeing not to join a club that wouldn't have had him anyway, then why not? But there are others, though, who are sort of saying, well, look, we have our own foreign policy objectives. There is a principle at stake here that we decide whether we're going to join NATO, not Mr. Putin. And we don't really want to be signing up to that kind of agreement, even if it does bring a short-term peace, because this week, right now, it will be NATO membership that Russia's complaining about. Next, it will be something else. And so there is some division of opinion over to what extent concessions should be made. And I think Mr. Zelensky has also now said that any concessions, if it does come to that, will have to be put to a popular referendum.
Colin, is there any talk on the ground about the potential for chemical and or biological weapons? Is there sort of elevated concern? Is anyone talking about protocols? Because here we see it as a different level of warfare. And I was just wondering if Ukrainians drew that sort of differentiation.
No, I've not heard anything on it. A few observations on that. I think this is something that President Biden has already said once or twice. It gets quite heavily reported because it's the US president saying it. I wouldn't rule out the Russians possibly using them somewhere in the field of battle, mainly for their psychological scare tactic rather than anything else. If you look at the range of weaponry that the Russians have, there's some pretty fearsome weapons that they've got. Just in the conventional, missiles and bombs category, would they really need to step over into using chemical weapons as well, and then, undoubtedly be consigning themselves to sort of further accusations of war crimes and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, no, I've not heard it mentioned as a great sort of concern yet. And I think also anyone who's been on the receiving end of some of these big missiles that have been landing, like the one that we had in Kyiv just yesterday, which demolished much of a shopping mall. You see something like that coming in and you think, that is quite scary enough. I don't need to sort of be worried about chemical weapons as well.
I don't want to put you on the spot with another sort of too abstract question, but has anything surprised you about the last 3 weeks and your reporting and what you've seen?
One thing that I think perhaps listeners might want to take away is that you see Kyiv on the news, with missiles landing in these huge high-rise apartment blocks, and it looks absolutely terrifying. When you're actually here, it's not quite like that. If you think of, say, London, imagine London with fighting in perhaps Ealing in the far west and Chigwell on the outskirts of London, or maybe Sevenoaks, one of the towns outside of London. And imagine that you're there and there's fighting there, but not anywhere else. In that situation, in a lot of parts of the city, life just continues as normal. And Kyiv is about half the size of London, so it's a pretty big city. It's not quite as scary as it seems, and also the idea that the Russians could completely surround this place hermetically, even with their full sort of army of 200,000. We did some calculations a few days ago that you'll remember that there was this big armoured convoy that was something like 60 miles long or something. Even that would only be able to go something like a third of the way around the M25, for example. In order to seal the city off hermetically, you would have to have, pretty much a kind of non-stop ring of troops around it, and then you would have to send people into the city to kind of to occupy it there, and that's before you get to the point where people are then fighting back, and you could potentially have the mother of all insurgencies going on here. And I just simply think, unless they got several million troops, I don't really see how they could occupy the city block to block, without encountering a great deal of resistance from people in between.
Dom, I don't know if you want to come in on this. This is something you've spoken about quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, we did some number crunching a couple of weeks ago, actually, and just thought it's just impossible. And they haven't got the troop density to surround the city, let alone try and have any meaningful impact inside, which, as we've said repeatedly, that's not necessarily a cause for great cheer, because that just invites the tactics we've seen further south with this sort of heavy artillery bombardment. But there have been reports, Colin, of Russian troops physically digging trenches to the north around Hostomel and what have you, which suggests that they're seeking to hold ground, maybe for any future negotiation, rather than try and advance their cause. I mean, are you getting these reports, or do they still seem to be attempting to get around to the west and the east and encircle the city?
Well, these northwest areas, yeah, I suppose the equivalent of somewhere like Watford, trying to take Watford, which is a satellite town just northwest of London. There's been debate over this for the last few weeks. Some people I've spoken to, military experts, seem to think that what they're trying to do is get a kind of secure foothold in that area around Hostomel and Irpin, which are separated from the Kiev main conurbation by a kind of a river area and so on, and effectively use that as a forward operating base, a sort of a safe space where they can kind of establish control, to then bring lots of heavy artillery in and other things, so that they can then start shelling Kiev from there. Or indeed use it as a forward operating base for ultimately invading. The Kremlin doesn't leak its plans, so nobody really knows. But they're not going away yet. On the other hand, you hear other people saying that the whole Kremlin, the whole Kiev operation is something of a decoy, while the Russian forces clean up or concentrate their forces on the eastern areas, and that once they've done that to their satisfaction, they might say, okay, right, we're up for a peace deal now, and hey, do you know what, guys, we're prepared to pull our troops from Kiev and present that as a concession. That they never, they'll agree not to besiege Kiev and try to take it, when actually they never intended to in the first place.
From everything you've seen in the last few weeks, Colin, what worries or concerns you the most about the direction this war is heading?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's like whenever you watch any war anywhere, these things usually happen because there's been bitterness sown by people over generations for one reason or another, and something like this lays the seeds of a lot more bitterness and anger, which might in future generations be taken out not just against, might be directed between Ukrainians and Russians in general, as opposed to, something that is been maybe started just by Mr. Putin. And that is concerning. It's also very sad just seeing the dates of birth of a lot of the people who are dying. You know, you see somebody born the year 2000, the year 1999, so on. You know, these are the sort of young millennial generation, and they're dying at a very significant rate. And also, if the Russians do try and take this city, I think all hell will break loose in terms of trying to occupy it. It will be the mother of all insurgencies. I was based in Baghdad after the fall of Saddam Hussein, where you had the Americans coming in, toppling a regime that was very unpopular and initially being, welcomed on the streets, cheered on the streets, and then within 6 months or so, they were fighting an insurgency that was not backed by any means, backed by the entire population. Whereas here, they are coming in, they are despised and hated from the word go. And if there is a serious insurgency here, it won't just be like the one that you had in Iraq, where it's guys with homemade, homemade roadside bombs and machine guns. It's going to be people armed with every bit of conceivable modern weaponry that you can imagine, probably with also CIA and MI5 backing, and the backing of several major nation states in and around the region. I think the idea that it would be Russia's Vietnam is perhaps putting it mildly, and let's hope that it doesn't get to that, because if you get an awful lot of Russian soldiers dying here, that will again sow those seeds of anger that my son died in Ukraine, and the whys and wherefores of it will often be forgotten. It's just blood being spilt between two nations, which is not a good thing. Sorry, that may sound a bit bleeding obvious, but there you go.
No, thank you. I realise we're starting to run out of time here, I think. So, Mutaz and Dom, are there any questions you have? Any at all?
Just a final one for me, if I may. Colin, so I was in Bosnia in the late 90s, Bosnia and Croatia, actually, and there was a I guess it was the Blitz spirit in action. It was just this kind of wild excitement amongst mainly the younger people. But I mean, is that the feel? What's the mood in Kyiv today? I mean, what do you do of an evening? How are you eating? Where are you going? What are you sort of experiencing every day?
There was a curfew from 8 in the evening, so there is not much nightlife, unfortunately. There was also a booze ban, which means there's no alcohol on sale anywhere, and it's pretty strictly enforced. I've heard reports of occasionally shops opening up and having when the police have got to find out about it, they've gone around smashing all the bottles and things like that. It's it's the wartime discipline is in force here. But I think in terms of the sort of Blitz spirit, if the soldiers that one meets at checkpoints are anything to go by, there's still laughs and smiles and politeness and courtesy at checkpoints, which does suggest that morale is still quite high, I guess.
Mutaz.
Just two final questions from me. I guess that just on that morale point, are people in Kiev surprised at how well their own army is, the Ukrainian forces are holding up? Everyone in the West is, I guess, surprised. I remember reading just before the invasion that a lot of people in Ukraine didn't believe the US intelligence reports about an imminent invasion, and the US intelligence was right about that. The US intelligence then believed that Russia would overrun Ukraine within a few days, and it was wrong. Is there a sense in Kiev of, we told you so, we told you we'd fight, and we told you this would happen? And the second, I'll ask the second one afterwards.
In terms, I think there is people were wondering whether the Ukrainian forces would simply crumble at the first sight of the Russian tanks. Yes, you do have to remember that the Ukrainians have been fighting the Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine for 8 years now. So they have a lot of people who have tasted combat already, who are battle hardened and who are well placed to defend their own cities when they saw Russian armour coming in. So that they're used to scrapping. As I said, in the cemetery that we went to a few days ago, you can see quite a few graves. So that they're not people who are afraid of a fight. I think that probably helps. Having said that, also I think that there was perhaps a few quite important victories at the beginning, or not victories, but examples where Ukrainian troops did carry on fighting. I think you had the incident at, I think it was called Snake Island, where some Ukrainian sailors told a Russian warship to get lost rather than surrender. It's not clear whether that incident was actually kind of quite as it turned out to be, but I think the sense, if you had some initial resistance that was put up, I think from the point of view of other Ukrainians wondering whether they should fight when their turn came. If they saw other people fighting, then they'd probably do the same. If they'd seen other troops surrendering, on the other hand, they might have thought, well, hang on, what's the point of me losing my life if lots of other people aren't? Why should I be the one to lose my life if everybody else is surrendering? And I think the dynamic has gone in the direction of everybody deciding that they are up for this fight. And of course, the terrain as well favours them. They're defending their home turf.
Yeah, and finally, you obviously have a fair bit of experience, but as a journalist, sort of going out, how are you keeping yourself safe? We've seen obviously quite tragic examples of journalists getting killed. So how do you think about sort of your own protection, how you approach people, or are you not thinking about that at all?
Well, the people, among the Ukrainians, we are, actually fairly popular, or at least tolerated. It's not like certain parts of the Middle East these days where being a Westerner can make you a target, and then. Or certainly amongst certain insurgent groups, it can make you a target. Where people have come unstuck, journalists have come unstuck, is in places like Irpin, which is one of the suburbs out towards the west, where like a lot of battle fronts, the front lines shift back and forth, and unfortunately, it is rather easy to drive down the wrong road or whatever, and suddenly find yourself in the line of sight of a Russian front line or whatever, who may choose to open fire on you. I wouldn't want to suggest that every Russian soldier is primed to open fire on any press vehicle that he or she sees. Two colleagues of mine, freelance colleagues, were up in and around the Irpin area, the contested area, about 2 weeks ago, ran into a Russian checkpoint in their car, were told to stop, and then had a rather hairy 5 minutes while the Russians checked their documents. And then the commanding officer, who they said seemed a pretty professional guy, just said, right, you're good, off you go, head back in that direction, please, and don't come back. So, you can be lucky, but you can also be very unlucky as well, and your vehicle can stray into the wrong area and suddenly find itself being fired at, and that's happened to a few people already. There is also a risk of shell fire as well, and I wouldn't just say it's the risk is purely from the Russian side either. You've got two groups of combatants pointing weapons at each other, cars that come up and that suddenly appear unexpectedly, can be mistaken for enemy vehicles in one manner or another, or saboteurs or whatever. And you can't just be a victim of trigger happy soldiers opening fire in friendly fire incidents.
Thanks, Colin. Just a final question from me. You mentioned you may be coming home rather soon. When you come home, do you think there's a particular memory from the past 3 weeks that will stand out for you, that when you think back you'll think of that thing first, and if so, what is it?
Of sort of speaking to people and seeing people here, possibly not that. If I'm honest, my abiding memory of this so far, having covered a few conflicts on the parties, is what's been going on in my own head. it's quite scary, because you think like, hang on, we're in a country where World War III might be starting, or something very similar. That this is proper grown-up warfare, with a proper grown-up Russian, the world's second superpower is on the other side. There is no part of the country. I was in Lviv for the first week in the West, well away from where the fighting was in Kyiv in the East. But you think like there is nowhere in this part of the world in this country that you cannot be reached by these Russian forces. They have satellite technology, they have drone technology, they have their hypersonic missiles, they have everything. They've got the full game kit, and it's quite an intimidating conflict to cover. Everything else I've ever covered has always been in the Middle East or in parts of Africa where it's localized forces, without access to really advanced weaponry, and that does make it scary. And if it scares me a bit, and I can go home if the going gets too tough, hopefully, God knows what it is like for the people who actually live here.
And we just heard from the Telegraph's Dominic Nicholls there, our defence and security editor. Earlier, he had the chance to speak to Iuliia Osmolovska, a former diplomat with the Ukrainian embassy, an international relations and negotiations expert, and a consultant to the Ukrainians during the ongoing peace talks. Dom started by asking Iuliia how you approach the act of negotiation in this type of conflict.
Well, to answer your question, we need to start with the previous mode of negotiation style that Russians have been applying to all this communication with Ukrainian side, because the conflict has started much earlier than just this direct invasion in February this year. Russian side always wanted to demonstrate that they don't see any use of talking to Ukrainian side. So this is what we call the strategy of avoidance of negotiations. So they always said that because Ukrainian political leadership doesn't impact anything in the country, so what's the use of talking to them? And actually, funny enough, but this philosophy or this logic still prevails in top Russian political leadership, because just today I've got information that despite the ongoing talks or so-called talks and negotiations on the working level, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, again refused to talk to Vladimir Zelensky upon the request of Ukrainian side. Eventually, question comes, what the Russian side using these negotiations for? We call their strategy as a sort of imitation of negotiations. So they're trying to present the case that they are quite cooperative side, which is looking for some way out of the existing conflicts and looking for solutions. But this is just the image, because on substantive elements, we don't see anything of this kind in real ground.
So this is like a phony war of negotiations. They're not serious at the moment.
Yes, they're not serious. You can analyze or judge about this assessment from different elements. First and foremost is the composition of the delegations. So you always have to understand that the opponent or the other party has enough autonomy for decision making. And that means that you are able to generate and to create some sort of creative options to consider further, rather than simply state and read the text which you've been prescribed to by the high authority before you enter the negotiation table. So this is not the case with the Russian side at the moment, because the head of delegation, someone called Mr. Medinsky, an advisor to President Putin, former Minister for Culture, but in negotiation realm, I never came across this name. So it was quite, I even could hardly recall how he looks like, because all of them are rather plain and unimpressive figures. Then the other guy who is at this negotiation team, he used to chair the Russian delegation to the Trilateral Contact Group, which is rather technical level, adjacent to the Normandy format, and they had no single authority to decide on any single aspect of the conflict. And the third guy, which is quite interesting choice of Russian side, is someone of the Russian politicians and MP called Mr. Slutsky, who is well known for his very harsh, offensive remarks, humiliating remarks about Ukrainians as such, the Ukrainian political leadership and Ukraine as a state. So once you bring in such a toxic figure at negotiation tables, which irritates obviously the other side. That means that you're not seriously interested in negotiations as such.
So how much autonomy should a negotiating team have? Do they have to work within a certain set of parameters that are given to them from above? I mean, how creative can they themselves be? How much can they sign up to without having to put everything back up to Moscow?
Well, it depends on different culture of decision-making of different countries. If you compare Ukrainian negotiation mode and Russian one, so obviously I would say that Ukrainian team has more room for maneuver in trying to explore different options and come up with different proposals. And the Russian side is more rigid, I should say. Decision makers, even they're not taken at the level of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia. So, the decisions are taken just by one person there. Then all of them subordinated to the lower levels. Therefore, it was very strange to listen or to hear the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, speaking after the meeting with our minister in Turkey recently, that we can't comment on any issues of the peace settlement, or we even can't consider them, because you have delegations and working groups talking on that on the level that you've set up a meeting in Belarus. So that means that definitely there is no real desire to seek for some viable solutions in negotiations.
So what should we look out for then? What will be the signs that Russia are coming to these negotiations seriously?
Well, it's not probably about the signs. It is about the moment of ripeness of negotiation. This is something which stems from the methodology of Philip Sartman about this moment of ripeness, which describes the situation when the two sides are ready to negotiate and to seek for some substantive solutions. This moment appears when both parties understand that the status quo they have at the moment is intolerable for both of them, and they can't resolve this issue unilaterally without communicating and engaging in cooperation with the other side. To my assessment, Russians still don't feel this sense of ripeness for them, despite the fact that they obviously underperforming heavily in battlefield, which definitely should have created an expectations that Russian side would be ready to compromise and show these signs of real engagement in negotiations. And this could be reflected through them lowering down their initial demands. But this hasn't happened. So when Putin actually declared about this decision to invade Ukraine, he put his extreme demands, which he would like to, which he seeks from Ukrainian or expects from Ukrainian leadership. That is to give up with European and NATO aspirations, to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, to recognize so-called independent republics in eastern regions of Ukraine, and also to stop completely all military and technical cooperation with Western partners. And if you look at the dynamic of these negotiations so far, Russians haven't withdrawn any of these demands, initial demands, which is quite strange, as I mentioned, because obviously if you're losing this this power for negotiation at the negotiation table, definitely you should be ready to compromise on something. They don't show these signs. Therefore, still my assessment of these negotiations, as you rightly said, at very, very early stage of real substantive talks.
And so what are you advising the Ukrainian government at the moment about their negotiating position?
Well, the first and foremost, we shouldn't concentrate at this stage on substantive elements of negotiations. We should assess the strategy of negotiations as such, which should be judged on the balance of power, because, as I said, this balance is shifting and becoming more favorable for Ukrainian side. That means that we could already push forward some of our initiatives and keep pressing Russians with something. So that is about the strategy of negotiations. Then it is about the Russian tactics they are playing. Most of Russians' actions are based on so-called Kremlin school of harsh negotiations, which is the mixture of methods of all the Soviet school diplomacy of Andrei Gromyko, the then Minister for Foreign Affairs of USSR, and also the combination of KGB elements based on deceit, on humiliation, on very stressful and aggressive and offensive behavior, the main goal of which is to put the opponent into emotional mode of assessing situation, which means that you can't assess rationally what is good, what is not very suitable for you, and a lot of manipulations are being used with this regard. So Russians are well known for these deceitful tactics, but this is not something which is known on wider scale to Ukrainian audience or to Ukrainian political elites, because they haven't been engaged in negotiations with Russians on a number of occasions on this particular sensitive issue. So we're advising basically on these tactics, we're advising on Ukrainian strategy, and this negotiation strategy should be flexible, adjustable to the situation, and always reassessing this balance of power. And then also it is about sequence of steps, sequence of issues to discuss, and it is about the different level of negotiations. So we shouldn't be just limited to this lower technical level, which doesn't, especially from Russian side, doesn't have an authority to decide on anything.
So how do you do that? How do you manage a team of negotiators if you're at the coalface and you are being humiliated and they are trying to get all these emotional responses from you? How do you stay detached from that to keep the negotiations going the way you want to, without getting feeling as if you have to jump in and counter every single annoyance that's thrown at you?
No, one of the most probably efficient tools is just to be ignorant to these personal offensive remarks, because, as I say, if you understand their logic, if you understand that they are doing this deliberately to get you out of a rational mode of thinking, so you can just simply be distracted from that, because what comes with manipulations, they are quite easy to be neutralized if you label this as a manipulation, if you recognize this as a tool of manipulating about you, and you can be just staying very balanced and untouched by this mood. So basically, when Russians are trying to behave like that, getting very personal, you just have to keep the poker face and continue and go on with rational stuff.
Now, we've heard President Zelensky say in recent days that the issue of NATO could be parked, could be on the back burner some years for the future. So he sounds as if he's willing to have a discussion about that and about future security guarantees. But in terms of sovereignty, will Ukraine accept any form of land being lost to Russia?
I don't see any possibility for that because recent public opinion polls show that Ukrainian society is not ready to compromise on these issues. They are quite confident that Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian political leadership has all the cards in their hands right now to play with the victorious game and to defeat Russia completely on all levels, on battlefield, in diplomatic and negotiation realms. Therefore, out of these expectations, it's very difficult. It would be very difficult for Ukrainian negotiation team and political leadership to compromise substantially on particular issues of territorial integrity and then to sell it to Ukrainian public. And this is something that Ukrainian negotiation team is not ready to consider and compromise at all. That means that more than 50% of Russian demands are not being taken into consideration right now. And then also we identify this as a sort of Russian strategic goal to play with this in order to create the distortion within Ukrainian society and split over these interpretations of the achievements or questionable achievements of Ukrainian delegation in these talks, and then to create to break this solidarity and unity and support of Russian society to Ukrainian society to Ukrainian political elites. So because Russians have this aim, they will be trying to negotiate such ambiguous commitments that they could be selling like betrayal of Ukrainian political authorities and negotiators, just in order to shake the society, to shake the Ukraine from within, and to break this solidarity that's been observed for the last months.
But equally, there's no room back for Putin, is there? I mean, he can't go out of he can't leave this without. I mean, he set out some maximalist aims at the start, and anything less than that will seem like a defeat for him, won't it? How are you able to negotiate and allow Putin, as offensive as it may sound, but allow him to save some face in this in order to get a negotiated settlement?
I don't think that right now there is the moment of ripeness in negotiations for both sides. And we are in a more beneficial position with regard to Russia because time plays in our hands. In a way, yes, definitely we suffer huge, horrific losses with human life, with all these devastations in our cities and towns. But Ukrainian society, Ukrainian people are ready to sustain this because they see actually the light at the end of the channel. They really count on victory of Ukraine over Russia in this war. Therefore, for Russians, for instance, this time is completely against them because if we're talking about this status quo and comfort zone in a particular moment, if the opponent is much bigger, much more powerful, then we work with this set of circumstances for him to make him weaker. And right now, this is precisely what's happening with Russia at the moment, because say in 2 weeks' time or a month's time, Russian internal environment or internal discontent with what's going on will be rising because of sanctions, because of all this. Still, you can't hide all the information about severe losses that Russia encounters in Ukraine these days. So there will be some sort of pressure from mothers who just don't know where their sons are. Then also complete a new wave of sanctions and the international boycott, which just increases the pressure on Russia political elites. Then also we already have heard information about big quarrels within the inner circle of Putin, of different sides blaming the other about this failure of Blitzkrieg in Ukraine. For instance, the Minister of Defense Shoigu blames the FSB people for not being correct with their calculations, which actually forced Russian political leadership to take the wrong decision and to enter Ukraine, and then they had all this military campaign suffered, and vice versa. Secret Service of Russia blamed the Minister of Defense for high corruptions and not very well prepared army to fight on Ukrainian territory. So this also will be shaking the situation from inside for Putin. And all these factors combined all together, also with poor performance of Russia on Ukrainian soil, this will create the moment when Russian political leadership definitely will come to understanding that they need some way out of this, because so far they don't show any signs of this understanding. And when they will, at this point, it would be crucial or important to have these talks on the highest level. So all these technical negotiations, they mean nothing to be true. And once political leaders meet, also with the assistance of international mediators, of bigger powers and players who are equally respected by both sides, I think that at this point in the future, a real substantive negotiating outcome is possible.
So it's very early days. I look forward to talking again as the negotiations start in earnest. But in terms of talking at the highest level, you've been in town for a couple of days. You met Boris Johnson. What did he say to you?
It was not me who actually met Boris Johnson. I know that the British side is also very keen to offer its expertise and advice on that. And this is, I personally, as a professional negotiator, consider as a very strong advantage because your country has good experience of settling this Good Friday Agreement for Ireland, which was closely studied by Ukrainian side as well, and a number of other professional expertise that we would like to bring in. So hopefully that we could comment and present some sort of very meaningful cooperation between Ukraine and UK on this particular aspect of international affairs as well.
Iuliia, thank you very much for coming in, and I very much look forward to chatting again.
Thank you very much for inviting. Thank you.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you found this show helpful, follow Ukraine, the latest on your podcast app. And if there's something we could do to make it even more useful, do let us know. You can email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine, the latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And on Twitter, Sophie Coe.